Contention what is framing the first argument is the role of the ballot is to endorse the best political method. The role of the ballot is to endorse the best political method. The second argument is political methodology is a prior question. Bad methods result in unpredictable outcomes, ultimately result in zero policy failure whenever you cannot tell whether or not about the methodology. You begin with a policy, will end with a good method, and ultimately results in bad things. The third argument is debate is already always a question of methodology. It's a question of whether or not we engage that position in first or third person. Our engagement allows for us to have an interpersonal relationship about how, and a discussion about how we should engage the political world. Consensus to his background. The first argument is that currently community colleges are where individuals can go to get education, especially for lower income individuals who cannot afford to go to larger four-year universities. The second argument is, however, community college is still too expensive for some, especially families who have to support children and other individuals, which indicates that they cannot sacrifice the money to be able to go to college and time away from their job. This means that the poorest individuals are affected by the cost-prohibitive nature of the status quo. The third argument is that also 21% of the United States, according to Professor Stallman of political science and history, cannot both read and write, which indicates that they have severe restrictions on their ability to engage the political sphere now. Thus, the text.
Stephen and I advocate that the United States federal government reduce the cost of community college to zero. Stephen and I advocate that the United States federal government reduces community college to zero. Yes.
Will you defend the implementation of the plan?
Like the fiat action
Yes,
plan?
that is my question.
What do you want? What do you guys want?
Yes, we would like you to defend the policy implications of the plan. Yeah,
Well,
that'd
then,
be
I
nice.
guess, sure, whatever.
So, if you are defending them, then what's your difference in political methodology?
The difference in political methodology? Yeah, that's like the songs here. Contention 3 is agonism.
Some point is that cross-prohibitive education is part of antagonistic politics. The first argument is that using capital-centric logic of profit as it relates to education makes the system rigged to privilege the rich. This makes political spheres inherently exclusive and only allows the richest individuals who can afford the education necessary to get there to be there in the first place. The second argument is creating systems where people can access to political education and discourages participation. The notion of politics becomes something out there for other people to participate in because you're not considered part of the elite group that is invited to the party. The third is exclusive modes of politics are inherently antagonistic. It begins with the perspective that certain people should have access to politics and others shouldn't. In an ivory tower position that relegates certain populations to periphery, i.e., you can say that because I went to college I deserve to be here, and you don't. The basic point is the plan solves. The first argument is that our advocacy of individuals is an authentic political act. We endorse as individuals that community college be free. This opens up this space to engagement that allows for liberal inclusions of voices, i.e., if you want us to defend fiat, sure, why not? Because you want to have that discussion, but we also want to have a discussion about what that means for us in round. The second argument is the plan itself is also a good method. We eliminate elitist status quo that is inherently exclusive to individuals who cannot afford to go to college by making it free. The third argument is that education can also encourage and lead to a more inclusive political spaces of plurality. People are able to go to college and learn about the differences in politics, and it encourages them to combine interests like debate, where they can find spaces to be able to engage in politics, but also encourages them to engage in the larger political sphere because they understand that they have the ability to make a change, and it's not just for other people, that it's for them as well. The fourth argument is the plan also demonstrates to the population the need for plurality, allowing for community college to be free, points out the very obvious that if you do not have the ability to read a ballot, then you are not able to vote because you don't know what their policies are. But also, if you're not able to write a letter to your congressman, that means that you cannot engage in the political sphere and request that certain policies be enacted or not enacted. That demonstrates the need for the population to get a plurality of education that allows for the political space to become more open. C's point is impacts. The first argument is that antagonistic policies are the root cause of all contemporary violence. The eighth point is that antagonism is the beginning with the idea that there can be both a friend and an enemy. This draws distinctions between populations of those who are on your side and those who are against you. The enemy is specifically identified someone who threatens your security. In the status quo as it relates to this particular policy, the enemy would be those individuals who would challenge the elitist power. That would be us. The beast point is that this ultimately results in the justification for violence. When you can say that someone is a friend and someone is an enemy, draws distinction between populations that allows for the identification of the other. In the first place, it justifies violence against those individuals because they're constructed as specific security threats, i.e., when you say that, the capitalist corporate market is a threat to our individual agency and we are a threat to the capitalist corporate agency, that means that there can be violence that takes place between those two because you can identify enemies. The sixth point is that this is an inherent part of all conflict. You can look to the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus and Tutsis, where they identified the other groups being animal snakes or venomous rats that allowed for this kind of political engagement of dehumanization. This is not an argument about how the broader spectrum of subjectivity operates, but rather that whenever you are able to deem a population as less than you, and specifically as it relates to someone who ought to be equal in that specific instance, it allows for the justification of violence and a hierarchical stance that leads to violence in the future. The disappointment is that violence is necessarily a bad thing.
if someone can take away your ability to have political engagement, someone can be violent towards you, then you become a tool to them. There is a mentality that instrumentalizes populations and makes them calculable and reduces them to a body count. The second argument is that political engagement is good. The eighth point is that engaging in politics allows for you to be able to be involved in a macro level structure that can change the way the world operates, i.e. you can identify problems in the world like poverty, starvation, and hunger that affects only the poorest individuals, and you can engage in that specific space. The basic point is that engagement is a necessary part of an agonistic political whereby the hegemonic ideology of the state is constantly in a state of flux, that there is no sedentary, entrenched power that cannot be challenged, like the United States Constitution has behind it loaded ideals that can never be challenged within the United States because of a hegemonic sedentary identity. Only a politics of agonism allows you to actually engage and talk about the reasons why the Constitution might be bad or good, whereas an antagonistic policy, anybody who talks about why the Constitution might potentially be bad or might be potentially written by 55 white men that then excluded all of the other individual populations, is excluded and considered an enemy of the United States. The case in point is that this kind of thinking is what allows for any kind of state-based violence, any kind of state-based justification for genocide, for the subsidization of the destruction of our natural habitat, or any other kind of impact can be justified in a world in which political engagement is disliked.
All right. It is going to be one off, and then on in order.
One of politics.
That would probably be a pretty poor choice. Just saying. Alright. The first off is going to be a counterplan. The text is that the United States federal government should reduce the cost of community college to zero for marginalized populations. The United States federal government should reduce the cost of community college to zero for marginalized populations. It's literally the red. Yeah.
Who is marginalized populations? Who are they?
Basically, anyone who's not advantaged in the status quo. All of the populations you refer to as people who are not being educated or people who don't have access to this are the marginalized populations.
For sure.
Going on to the competition, one is going to be the mutual exclusivity. You cannot do this because if this advocacy is just a narrow version of your advocacy, which means that there's no functional perm here. If you advocate for everyone, then you can't advocate for one specific group, which means that we're doing this. Additionally, the second argument here is that this competes through net benefits. You'll see that there's going to be several solvency points that you don't access that we're going to be accessing here. Additionally, the solvency here is that one, this solves for people who are in specifically like economically disadvantaged populations that don't have the ability to do this. They talk about a lot of people who can't afford community college. This specifically targets those individuals and gives them the ability to have these loans, or to not have loans, sorry, to get their education for free. The second here is that focusing on marginalized populations is better because then you don't just give everyone a blanket slate. People who are rich can already afford these colleges, which means that you are just advantaging them even more because they just stockpile their savings accounts, which means that you only allow them to go even further, and you just push these populations into a further unadvantaged people into a further disadvantaged situation. The third argument here is going to be the net benefit. The one is that you just let the rich push out the poor under the affirmation. The little a is that the rich will be able to take up the free community college if they want to save, which means that there won't be any room for people who are trying to get in. Additionally, the little c is that this is a critical space for them to, or there's a critical space and that is limited to them, which means that they're not going to have the ability for everyone to get in. So if people of a wealthy standpoint start to come into these community colleges, it's not going to allow for everyone to get in, and people are inevitably going to be left out, which means that you are not going to have the ability to do this. Additionally, you can look to in 2013 that there were 15,000 people on waiting lists for 4.3% of...
Sorry, for 4.3 less sections.
4.3% less sections in the community colleges, which means that they're already stretched right now, meaning that they don't have the resources to do this. The little c here is that this is going to turn the entirety of their case when they don't have the ability to let people into the space to have education is going to be the reason why they're not going to be able to do this. Additionally, the little d is that the counterplan solves the entirety of the affirmation. We have the ability to do this. We have the ability to garner the impacts of their case, which means that this is always going to be able to check back.
Question.
Yeah.
What rich white kids are going to go from Orange County to a community college in the Bronx?
They probably wouldn't move, but they would start flooding schools like Orange Coast Community College and these areas, and they're going to do it because it's free, because they can stockpile their money and get all the free toys. Why would you spend $50,000? Additionally, there's going to be another argument because this really puts you in a double bind. It's going to be on your case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Additionally, the counterplan is our methodology, like this is our advocacy,
Yeah.
our engagement.
Which
The
is
counterplan is the methodology, which basically says that we should have politics that help people who are being marginalized right now to allow them to have an equal playing field, because just incentivizing and helping out populations that are fine right now is never going to be able to level the playing field. You have zero ability to solve when you only advantage everyone equally. It means that the rich are going to stay rich, that the advantaged are going to stay advantaged, and that the poor are just going to stay where they are. Additionally, going on to their case. First on the rule of the ballot, they say that it's whoever has the best political methodology, but they don't give you a different political methodology. They just say that they advocate for it, which is not a political methodology whatsoever. They have no ability to garner anything other than using the United States federal government, because they say that we should be looking at policy implications, which is always going to be going through normal means, which means that they're never doing this. We should say, we would say that additionally we act, there's no reason why they do this. So we would say that our counter rule of the ballot would be whoever best helps marginalized populations. Their impacts are all trying to go to this, which means that this is the actual rule of ballot they're looking at, so you should always prefer this, because no one is giving you a different political methodology than is happening in status quo, which means that you should always look to who is helping out populations that are disadvantaged first. Additionally, they say that the rest of their framework arguments have absolutely no warrants to why we can do this. That you can extend across that they say that they should have to defend the actions of the fiat plantex, but we're going to be running on the methodology. Going on to the background. Okay, our first argument here is that they say that the poorest people can't read and write. We would say that there's no ability for them to solve this fact. There's no ability for them to get them to do this, because if you were illiterate, you were probably going to get into community college, but then maybe you won't be able to pass the classes, which is going to be uniquely harmful. Additionally, the overstructure on the services is always going to be worse, because people who are illiterate have the ability to go to services, but when you influx the system, it leads to the collapse of those services, and they're not going to have enough appointments to be able to to be able to help every individual, which means that these individuals are going to go to community college, but maybe they won't be able to actually get the resources they need, which means that it is specifically key to isolate populations that need this the most, meaning that they can have the ability to reach out to these services, and the services won't be overflooded, so they actually have the propensity to become literate and to garner their education, which means that they can succeed in the educational system, and their success is key to actually getting to the impacts. If you overflood the services, and if you have people, like everyone going in there, that means that you're never going to be able to do this. Did you have
Move on, Solomon.
Got it. Going on to solvency.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no solvency here. They just say that they advocate for it, but they're not actually going to be able to garner anything whatsoever. Additionally, you can extend across the fact that the rich just keep getting richer, and our second argument here is that either that, or you just reinforce the dichotomy between the rich and the poor, which leads to exclusion, because the rich people will be able to afford the good colleges, they will be able to afford the four-year universities, and you don't do anything to allow these people to afford universities after, which means that the only people getting bachelor's degrees are going to still be the people who can afford it, which means that you're never actually going to be able to solve this back, and this is an entire turn-on case, because if they only allow people who are of a wealthy standpoint to afford four-year universities, then they reinforce the dichotomy that they are better, because people have the stigma in their mind that these universities are better than community colleges, which means that just doing this is only going to push that even further. Yep.
Turn they assimilate different methodologies into a formalized education structure, which excludes different ideas.
The next argument is that they assimilate a bunch of different ideologies into one structure, which basically forces everyone to conform to one ideology, which is going to exclude other types of thinking. Additionally, they exclude people who don't think in the conventional educational system, which means that people who learn in different arenas, or they want to go to, like, say, a trade school, or maybe like another like biotech or something, they push them out, and they say that you still have to pay and don't have the ability to go, and they make everyone do a formalized education, and formalized education isn't absolutely for everyone, which means that your simulation is going to violently exclude those who don't conform to traditional education policies, which is going to be a relink to your criticism. Okay. What else?
Turn they assume that you have to have a formalized education to engage in political structures. There are town hall meetings. You can call congressmen.
The next argument here is turn. They assume that you need a formalized education to be involved in the political situation. You only need to be 18. There is no reason why you need a degree. This assumption is it just proves that their logic is coming from a place where you need that privilege to get it. There's absolutely no reason why you can't be involved in politics, why you can't go to town hall meetings. Some people with the least education are the most involved. There are people who only have high school degrees that are in DC right now and were elected by the U.S. public, which means that you are never going to be getting this. Your flawed assumptions are going to be damning, especially when you want to look at methodologies. It's probably pretty problematic that you say if you don't have an you're assuming that if you don't have an education, you can't can't be involved. That is extremely problematic, especially when you don't solve for everyone being educated, meaning that you're still excluding people from the political realm and not allowing them to actualize their advocacies.
Counterplan, case stricken. Actually flip that.
So case then.
Correct. So everybody ready? First argument, there's no warrant why they say that we're not a difference. They say that we're simply an advocacy and that we're normal means. This is absolutely ridiculous. You can extend across the frameworks number 1, 2, and 3, which indicates that we are a political method, that we engage in a different political method than is what is in the status quo, because we indicate that bad methodology leads to zero policy failure, which is the status quo, but additionally, that necessarily the key methodological space to know to be able to question these interpersonal things. This means that we are engaging in a methodology, but additionally, the agonism is different from the political methodology of the United States, which is currently antagonistic, which means that we are in fact advocating for a different methodology of political engagement, whereas you are still antagonistic because you were labeling populations as being necessarily marginalized, which means that you have thereby identified them and allowed for the otherization that we talk about. But additionally, the second argument, they say that the counterplan helps marginalize people, that no one's going to give you different. Like, I don't even know what the fuck this argument means. But you can cross-apply the analysis, which would indicate that they would allow for otherization because they would necessarily have to identify what the marginalized populations are, but additionally then
we pretty much agree about the framework.
But additionally, next argument, they say on background, they say that there's no ability to solve back because we're not able to pass these things. Our argumentation that necessarily we wouldn't be able to solve back. You've conceded that 21% of individuals in the United States are not able to read or write, which means that all of your argumentation about, which means that all of the, I'll get to those later, but they say that we're not able to solve back, which indicate yes we are. At the point at which we indicate 21% of the population be able to involve in the political process, then yes we do. But additionally, the next argument, they say the overstretch of services argumentation is that one you can look at the teachers, you can look at the market for teachers. If you are a teacher, you know anything about that, whenever there's an influx of students, there's a proportional increase in the number of teachers. That's just the way that the teaching market works, because societies always need teachers, which means that the normal means would just be able to resolve back to this because we would just increase the number of teachers. But additionally, the second argument is that there's no propensity for overstretch in the status quo because these individuals are not getting access to this, which means that these programs are just sitting there dormant, which means that there's only going to be able to capitalize on them in the world where they can't actually get an education. But additionally, the last argument is that this is at least mitigation. That means we would still be able to solve for at least some portion of that 21%, which means that it's still advantageous to vote affirmative. But additionally, the last arguments, they say that the on the solvency arguments, they specifically say that we're not able to solve because we allow the rich to get richer. This is fucking stupid. Like, this is a ridiculous argument. The first argument is that there's literally no warrant coming out of the LOC which would indicate why rich white people or why rich anybody, 1%ers, would necessarily go to community colleges whenever they can just pay for Ivy League universities or just buy their way in. This means that your counterplan arguments, like the offense that you try to push out on the counterplan, is ultimately irrelevant because there's literally no propensity that this offense actually is triggered. But if there's any propensity that the offense is triggered, that I think that we can win that 1%ers are 1%ers, i.e. that the community colleges would be able to necessarily subsume the impact of these new students, which means that also they say that we allow the rich to get richer. That's not true. We don't reinforce a dichotomy between these individuals. We allow these individuals to be able to hash out their differences. Your counterplan is necessarily antagonistic because you would say we're only helping out the marginalized individuals. That is actually the dichotomy which allows the rich to say, look at what you're doing to the fucking poor people. You're allowing them to do these things, and that's what allows people like rich white GOP members to say, oh, well, we should cut funding from inner city black kids, but that we should line our pockets with corporate tax rates and stuff like that. You are the one that is necessarily redefining this dichotomy. The next argument, they say that we don't solve anything because that would mean that only rich individuals would be able to get a bachelor's degree as a student. This is kind of a silly argument considering that you probably have exposure to community colleges and you realize that, I don't know, maybe 4-year universities offer scholarships to those individuals graduating from community colleges based off of, academic performance and shit like that, which means that they would necessarily be able to get access to that. But additionally, the next argument, they say that we would assimilate into one structure. There's literally no warrant for this. We do not say this anywhere. We're simply saying that individuals are being excluded from the political process in the status quo. Nowhere do we say assimilation or you have to, abide by our political ideology. We're simply saying that we think it's a fucking good idea that these individuals should be able to read and write so that they can voice their political concerns and the things that are happening to them in the status quo. Because right now, they are violently excluded. You can cross-apply the impacts which indicate that this is the root cause of contemporary violence. Whenever the USFG or other governments are allowed to say that these populations are not able to read and write, that allows them to push them into the periphery and commit any sort of level of violence against them because these individuals aren't able to retaliate. Just look at fucking Guantanamo Bay in Abu Ghraib, where we simply said that you don't have access to the court system, you do not have access to any of this. When we push them into the periphery, that allows us to commit violence. Your question quickly, hurry.
So you have to write a letter to your congressman to talk to
No,
them.
but you have to be able to read in order to vote. That is the solvency number one.
You also, when you construct politics as something that is out there, that you, like, that...
No more questions. No more questions. They say that we assimilate, I've already answered this argument. They say we exclude people who don't operate within the educational system. Our argumentation is that we don't exclude these individuals. We don't say that it's, this isn't North Korea. We're not simply saying that you have to come to the school. We're simply saying that these individuals are excluded in the status quo, and that there's only a propensity that we would be able to solve back for that. But additionally, they say formalized education is necessarily violently excluded. That is the status quo. These individuals are violently excluded in the status quo. We're not telling them to prescribe to some formalized education. We are merely giving them access to education, which they do not have in the status quo, which means that all of your arguments are
a choice.
Yeah, all of your arguments are the status quo. That means that none of your offense is unique to the affirmative. There is only a propensity that we would be able to overcome the last argument. They said that we would assume a formalized education. That's key to be able to involve in the political process. This is not in the PMC. The PMC solvency says individuals have to be able to read in order to vote. That is the very basic political process.
But also, it's a question of choice.
But also, it's a question of choice. These individuals want to be involved in the process, but they cannot be. You can extend across that antagonism is necessarily the root cause of all contemporary violence. If I prove that their counterplan is necessarily antagonistic, that is offense that they're not going to be able to wiggle out of. But additionally, you can extend across why necessarily the plan would be able to solve, because we've endorsed freedoms and liberal. I have 2 minutes now. The plan is a good methodology. Also, education leads to. You can extend across the third solvency, which is perhaps the most important. That education is necessarily essential to the increase in plurality. That is damning for them whenever they don't increase the plurality. Go to the counterplan. The first argument is perm do both, perm do both. There's not a textual reason why I'm not able to do this. This counterplan isn't even textually competitive, and there's not a functional reason why I wouldn't be able to do this, which means that the first is going to be the net benefit to perm, which if there's any solvency that the affirmative isn't able to capture, the perm would necessarily have solvency surplus, which means that it's more net beneficial. But in addition, the second argument, the first argument on the counterplan proper is the third argument. The first argument is that that is what the object of the question was. Who is marginalized? That necessarily requires some level of identification where they impose some arbitrary metric of who is necessarily marginalized. This allows the political to be seated in individuals like the right wing to be able to say, well, this is necessarily what the measure of marginalized is, which means that these individuals are just further precluded from the status quo. But additionally, the second argument is that you engage in otherization and stuff like that. When you say marginalized, that necessarily puts these individuals on the outside, in the periphery. But additionally, you would necessarily paint these other individuals, the rich individuals, as necessarily bad ones. That ignores the transitive nature of hegemony under an agonistic model of government, where we necessarily, perhaps these white individuals have power in the status quo, but necessarily the roles could flip and the white individuals are the ones necessarily on the receiving end. Argumentation is that in a world where you engage in any sort of antagonism, that ignores the transitive nature of hegemony, that we have to treat everybody as not necessarily an enemy, but as an adversary, to note the temporality of that. In a world where you essentialize them and say that they are marginalized and that there are 2 definitive groups, that allows for the violence that we talk about in the PMC to occur. But yeah, what's up?
Also, if you don't define who the marginalized is, then there's no distinction between the counterplan and the affirmative.
Yeah, also, if you don't define who the marginalized populations are, that means that there's no distinction between the counterplan and the affirmative, which means that the counterplan is functionally the Aff, which means perm.
Which means you vote Aff.
Yeah,
there's no reason to vote
Next,
Neg.
they go to solvency. They say economically disadvantaged. You can classify the analysis which indicates that this is necessarily antagonistic and also engages in otherization calculus, where they have to bifurcate, or where they have to engage in these, where they have to dichotomize these individuals. That allows for the arguments where they talk about why we allow the rich to get richer, and that causes like the class warfare, the dichotomy arguments. They are the ones redefining the system. But additionally, the next argument is they said they said the rich takes the community college. The first argument is going to be turned. You can classify the teacher's argument, which indicates that there's an influx in students. There's going to be an influx in teachers, which indicates that we're going to be able to solve back for this better. But additionally, the second argument is that there's a low propensity that rich people were necessarily to go to community colleges, which means that your offense is bunk. Look, the debate is over. The counterplan is the affirmative. They do not have all answers to our offense, and it's over.
So the counterplan, and then it'll be the solvency, then the topic case, which is like the framework.
Did not notice how hot it was in here until after speech.
Okay, so counterplan, and then framework, and then case?
No, it's counterplan, case, framework.
Counterplan, case, framework.
Pretty good. Except in permutation, we're not going for this counterplan, because you obviously don't like it. However, you can extend across that, even if they try to go with the counterplan as a relink to their criticism, you can look to the fact that not only would the permutation be a relink because they're still endorsing the same methodologies, however, additionally, you can look to the fact that these 2 things are not competitive as an indication to why we can default to the status quo, and why your methodology is bad, you should feel bad. Case. 3 arguments we're going for. First is the relink. You allow for the rich to get richer. We have several warrants as to why this is true. First is that, first you can see the analysis says that the rich white individuals who are currently privileged by the status quo would only take up these positions in the community college circuit. You can see the warrant that says that space in community colleges are limited. You don't provide for an expansion. You can look to the specific analysis that says that that last year there were 15,000 individuals on the community college waiting list for 4.3 sections. An indication to why not only is your argument as to why when there are more students there are more teachers just empirically disproven, but additionally this only proves it why the individuals who have access to the monetary value and have the ability to take up these spaces in the community college circuit only excludes these excludes marginalized populations to the periphery and only allows for state-based violence that you talk about. An indication to why you are relating to your criticism. But the second argument we're going for is about the political. That you are an assimilation of these viewpoints. That you only that you assimilate any different ideology from the externalized through a formalized education system. We say the formalized education system is one that allowed for the removal of different viewpoints. That your classes very rarely say that maybe socialism is a good idea. However, you can look at the fact that this only makes it so that everyone has a singular viewpoint. Our argument is that this only leads not only to the state-based violence, because the fact that we exclude anyone who is excluded from this further out to the periphery, because there are more individuals at the center. But in addition, we say that this probably turns the entirety of your criticism. That the engagement through the political through this mechanism makes it so that we can never actually solve the problems we talk about. Our argument is that individuals who do engage through the system in only this way very rarely are able to create the macro level changes that you talk about. As an indication of why your methodology working through these formalized education systems is probably bad. The PMR is probably going to make these arguments about how is going to go for these arguments about how you have to be able to read and write in order to be able to get access. Our argument is that you probably don't solve this. A couple of reasons. One is that you probably have to read and write in order to be able to write the application to get into the community college in the first place, indicating this is probably the wrong place in order to be able to resolve this issue. Additionally, second is that you have to be able to read and write in order to be able to pass classes. An indication of why you are not creating the same kind of education that you say is necessary to engage. An indication of why the affirmative is not able to resolve for the political arguments that we talk about. Indicates that this probably turns the entirety of the affirmative case and really leads to worse violence. Third argument, which is the one I knew you like, is the argument that says that you assume that formalized education is key to engage within the political sphere. No. There are multiple ways to engage within the political sphere, absent just being able to interface for writing a letter to your congressman. You can go to a town hall meeting and voice your opinion. You can talk to your congressman. You can engage in all sorts of meaningful political debate, not just through talking to congressmen. Is the argument that you not only engage in and you assume that this is the only mechanism to solve means that your methodology is bad. But additionally, this probably leads to the same form of formalized violence that you are talking about. Our argument is that this means that your methodology is bad. When you are going on the framework level for that, that the judges should vote for the best methodology. If their methodology is just straight up wrong and bad, is probably the reason why you should be voting against them. They say the status quo is violently excluding these individuals now. However, this is not the argument. Our argument is the argumentation is about methodology. Is that if you are saying that methodology is important here, that assuming that you have to have a formalized education in order to be able to engage in the political sphere is probably a bad methodology. It's an indication of why the status quo arguments just don't matter in this instance. Additionally,
relink on the rich, they only reinforce the economy. Look at the fact that
this is
Ivy League.
This is also the relink into the criticism. They talk about how the Ivy League education is the one that is the only one that's able to engage. It's an indication of why the affirmative and the methodology that they talk about, the entire rhetoric of the PMC is only a re-engagement. Additionally, they say that the PMC only says that you have to read to vote. This isn't true. Like, there are people at polling booths who can read you the ballot. You can have discussions outside of the polling places. You can have those discussions, be able to engage in the political sphere, to have individual activism in order to be able to resolve for these, in order to be able to vote and be able to engage within the political sphere. Additionally, another warrant for being able to engage outside the political sphere is through things like microfinancing. That you have things like crowdsource financing, where individuals can donate small amounts of money to larger political causes in order to be able to create change within the world. Or you can look to the fact that this has been able to create things such as in Bangladesh, where this has been able to help fund individuals establishing their own businesses. This has created a change within the world on a political level. However, it is not required a formalized education in order for people to engage. It's not only proves that your entirety of your advocacy is wrong, but also is bad, because this would exclude your advocacy would exclude this kind of understanding, this kind of political engagement to the periphery, making it so that there's no way to engage. Anything else there?
I mean, just reinforce the fact that they're saying that the rich people are going to be able to afford Ivy League means that they create that dichotomy and quality of education.
Yes, the MG only relinks themselves over and over again through this dichotomy argument. the PMC and the methodology that they're saying is that we shouldn't be able to be excluding individuals to the periphery because of the fact that they can't engage in the political sphere. Arguments that you only re-entrench this. That community college not only is the wrong place to have a starting point for this kind of political mechanism, but additionally that only excludes individuals to the periphery because it means there's overstretch. They will try and go for this, that more and more students means there can be more and more teachers. This is empirically disproven. We have shown this over and over.
It's a double bind. If they don't go to community college, then they're going to the better education, and you still reinforce the dichotomy of better education versus the community college.
Yeah, and this also proves the double bind argument we've been making, that if the rich individuals are only going to the four-year institutions, an indication why the community college education probably wouldn't have the same form value as they discussed, and only would create more exclusion to the peripheries, an indication why the plan only makes this worse on the framework discussion. We only need a couple of arguments here. First is that the role of the ballot is that you should endorse the best political methodology. Their methodology is bad. If we have proven that at the end of the debate, then the rest of the discussion is over. Because we can prove that the mechanism through which they view the world and the way that they try to approach these is bad is an indication why you should not be voting for them. But additionally, they try to extend their argumentation and says that methodology leads to policy failures. All of these arguments don't engage with the analysis that we are giving you. That the way that you evaluate this round is through methodology, which means that we prove substantially through the solvency discussion is an indication of why your methodology is bad. Means this doesn't resolve for any of the analysis that you're going for. Additionally, they make arguments about how we only allow for the otherization through the identification of the marginalized individuals. Like this analysis, it doesn't engage with what we're giving you through the actual solvency discussion. Like yes, the counterplan may link to this. However, we're out of that discussion. There's no way as to why you'd be voting for this.
Primary links.
And the permutation it would probably be a relink because they're engaged in that same sort of political methodology. Permutation is just a test of competition as proves why these two things would not be competitive as an indication of why you would not be voting for the affirmative via the relink through the permutation as an indication of why this doesn't matter. This probably means the affirmative, the negative outweighs. We've given you not only how the affirmative not only doesn't resolve the issues they talk about, how they make it worse. It's an indication of why you're going to be voting on the case today.
Alright. It's going to be an overview, and then framework, and case in order. You're going to be losing this round because they're going to go hard that we need another methodology and that we need something else other than status quo. But we don't. If we can prove to you that their methodology is bad through the case turns, there is a reason to reject their methodology, which means that you prefer the negative on the fact that status quo would be better than their antagonistic policy that they are advocating for. They don't answer back our arguments clearly, which means that you're always going to be voting here. The biggest part that you're going to be voting on is the double bind that they sink themselves into. They say that you can extend across that the rich people are going to be taking up these positions. The only warrant on this is coming out of the LOC saying that there's already 15,000 people on the waiting list who are not able to access this education. When you don't actually create an avenue for there to be more positions, it means that you are only allowing rich people to come in and take up those positions and further push out populations that are disadvantaged, which means that you are only going to be perpetuating this. Additionally, their answers to this bite straight into the argument that we say they only reinforce the dichotomy. They only reinforce the fact that rich people are going to be getting better educations. They say they wouldn't go there because they have access to Ivy League. They wouldn't go there because they have access to better educations. This is the exact type of rhetoric that they are trying to get away from. They say that dichotomies equal the violence and the types of otherization that they're talking about, but yet they are relinking themselves right into this extremely hard when they have no ability to get out of this. And when they keep telling you that these people won't go there because they have the money to go somewhere else, it means that they have zero ability to solve this, and it's a huge turn that puts them straight back into the dichotomy that they say creates violence. Additionally, the next turn that we go for is that you force formalized education. This assimilates people into one type of structure. They're probably going to go for that. They only create an avenue to access, but when you incentivize that avenue, it means that people are going to go there, which really tries to assimilate people into that area, especially people who do not have resources, meaning that you only create the harms even further because you push everyone into this area, and people who don't want to or can't survive in the formalized education are going to be violently excluded, which is going to be a bigger impact than your own impact when you see that people aren't going to be able to get into the education system and succeed. Additionally,
This also impacts to the exclusion of different forms of political ideology that allow for the challenge.
and this also impacts out to the forms of excluding different types of political ideology, such as when people are completely pushed into the Western canon and you were always told that the West way is the right way. It pushes out other ideologies and forces them to assimilate into one ideology, which excludes these different political things. So your political activism is never going to matter when you only have one way of being active in the system, and you deny other people the way that they choose to be active. This is only going to amplify your own impacts and turn the entirety of your case when you see the violent exclusion. Additionally, the next turn here is that they make a huge assumption that we need education to be politically involved. This just demonstrates that their own methodology is a worse link than before, because the status quo doesn't force you to have education to be involved in politics, but they're trying to say that you need education to be involved in politics. This is a unique argument why status quo is always going to be preferable, because you only need to be 18 and you can have a ballot read to you at the ballot polls and still vote that way. Their drastic assumption that you need to be educated to be involved in politics is the exact type of ideology that they are trying to critique. This ideology is the ideology that says that you shouldn't have a voice if you're not educated, which is the types of things that they are not solving back for and only reifying through their methodology.
And engagement through other mechanisms outweighs singular voting.
And engagement through other mechanisms and the ability to create multiple avenues of change is going to outweigh the singular voting impact that they're talking about. When we allow for the multiplicity of ideologies and different ways of thinking, it outweighs their one antagonism.
Overview, framing, case straight down. Everybody good? There's this great thing in debate that you gotta have to win. It's called uniqueness, and you got none of it. The first reason you're voting affirmative is that the status quo is one of antagonism and dichotomies between the rich and the poor that we are trying to eliminate by allowing for individuals to get access to education if they want it. You have conceded an argument in the FG that it is a question of choice. If an individual wants to be able to go to college, but they cannot afford it, they should be able to. Done. The end. That's the act. Second is that you consider that people are discouraged now because they have the perception that you need a formalized education in order to be included because there is the notion of the ivory tower politics that has been constructed as something that is out there that you cannot engage in if you don't have this kind of education. For those individuals who don't already know that you can go engage in local stuff, it allows them to get education to learn about the kind of politics that you're talking about. The third reason is that you're voting for is that endorsing the best political method is not requires a comparison of what it means to vote negative versus what it means to vote affirmative. If you vote affirmative, you have a risk of being able to solve these problems. If you vote negative, you are voting for a methodology that does nothing in the face of antagonism.
They concede all our offense, which
you concede all of our offensive reasons why antagonism is bad, and that there is a risk that agonism is able to solve that. You do not have a reason why agonism specifically is bad. Framing debate. I've already talked about this in the overview. Role of Ballast endorse the best methodology, not the good or bad methodology. The affirmative is the best method in this debate because the negative method is doing nothing. Yeah. Case faith. First, you say that we allowed the rich to get richer. This makes literally no sense in the context of the status quo. If it is true that the status quo is rooted in a capital-centric logic that allows for individuals to be able to get access to education that is considered to be better based on having more money, then you vote affirmative because it allows for the ability for individuals to get access to education, to be able to move, to be able to have an engagement that is on par with that. That means that we would be able to solve this argument because it literally allows for people to engage and challenge the way that the status quo operates. If you are honestly making the argument that the 1% are already not dominant, then what are you talking about? Because you're not talking about the United States. Next, you say that we assimilate different viewpoints into this one kind of ideology. Plurality is the ideology that we want. It's pluralism. We want every ideology to get a voice. That means that you are your link argument is that you are assimilating people into having to not assimilate other people into your ideology. This makes literally no sense in the context of what an agonistic model of the political means. You have conceded all the analysis that indicates that within agonism, it is about not calling people their enemies and friends and drawing distinctions between those two groups, but rather adversaries with all the same goals of political freedom and the ability to engage. That means that we would solve back all of your assimilation arguments because the status quo is one of antagonistic capital-centric logic. You don't have to answer this argument. Next, you say that we don't solve for literacy. This is irrelevant because people are discouraged in the status quo from engaging in politics because they believe it's a macro-level structure that they don't have access to. Your argument that other people can engage at a local level without being literate is not an answer to the affirmative's argument that certain people don't want to engage in that because they feel like they don't belong, because they don't have an education. We allow them the choice to go. We don't make you go if you don't want to. If you're already engaging there, there's no reason we stop you from doing that.
One word. I think the PMC and the MG are largely going for this argument that you have to be literate and you have to vote in order to be able to engage. I think the PMR's articulation that people feel discouraged from voting because they don't have this education, I believe is new. I think it's very contradictory to a lot of the MG, specifically when he's saying you only have to vote.
No, listen. The third uniqueness argument out of the PMC on contention 3 is exclusive modes of politics are inherently antagonistic because they begin with the perspective that certain people should have access to politics and others shouldn't. Is an ivory tower position that relegates certain populations to the periphery because they feel that they don't belong within a sphere of politics. Argument has always been, and is extended in the MG, that as long as we allow for people to have a choice, you should vote affirmative.
It's right after political education and the elite group argument.
Yeah, I feel like this argument is all overflow.
Under consideration.
Yeah. Is everybody ready?
I was gonna before the point where so. Yeah, the rich get richer double bind argument, they're lying about what I said. I did not say it's a better education, it's just the 1%ers.
Yeah, we just say that 1%ers have this notion that you have to go to an Ivy League college. They can afford it, so that's where they go. That's where they go in the status quo.
That's not how I feel.
You don't, the argument is that you don't have a reason why making community college free means that rich people who can already afford to pay for Harvard are going to go to Tyler Junior College. It doesn't make any logical sense in the context of capital-centric logic, which dominates the status quo.
It's not reinforcing a dichotomy.
Fifth argument is you say that it's not about uniqueness, it's about whether or not we have a good or bad method. However, this argument does not preclude the fact that the affirmative has a risk of being able to solve problems in the status quo and voting negative does not. Framework does not fiat uniqueness for your case terms. That doesn't make any sense in the context of the affirmative. Also, you say that we talk about Ivy League and how that causes people to think that people can read you the ballot and that you can always engage on a local level. This does not preclude that from happening in the status quo. It just means that if you have a choice and you want to go to college but you can't afford it because you got 3 kids who all have special needs, you have to pay for all of that, and you can't afford to go to college, we make it to where maybe you have the chance to do that and you can engage on a broader structure. Additionally, you said that you cannot create change because of the way to engage. Our way to engage is good. You don't have an impact turned to agonism. You have an impact turned to this assimilation argument. It doesn't make any sense in the context of the affirmative. You say that there's a rich people dichotomy. That's the status quo. You don't have an argument about how phrases like Ivy League don't exist in the status quo. Yes, quickly.
Overstretch of the services.
Oh yeah, you say that. You say that people don't go to CC because there's an overstretch in services, and we said that there's a risk that more teachers happen. But also, you don't have any logical reason why people go from Harvard to a community college when they're already the rich, trying to maintain that status. That means that there's only a risk the affirmative is able to resolve this. You have no uniqueness for any of your offense. You vote Aff on a risk to solve the root cause of all violence.
I voted for Nevada, and
I voted for you.
the argument I voted on is this case term that is the Aff, a method dissent to the Aff that says that you create a violent exclusion because of the presumption that you need to have a formalized education in order to engage in political contestation. To me, this is a pretty serious method dissent to your Aff. I think that your Aff is entirely contingent on this assumption. This is your solvency mechanism about why your Aff would create political inclusion and why you know.